Okay, so great. Welcome everyone, and I'll hand you over to Earl. Thank you, Earl.
All right, thank you, Advinder, for inviting me to give a talk to your students and collected guests here. And I'm really excited to have a chance to break out of my isolation a little bit here and connect with some more folks. Let me get my screen share started here. All right, I'm just trying to figure out how to manage this little part. Can I get that? It's always hard to get people on the screen in a place where I feel like I'm talking to people instead of talking to the side. So I'm going to talk today about the social-ecological challenges of the Anthropocene, but more importantly, some of the opportunities that we have to embrace the scaling of human societies as a way of actually potentially creating a better situation than we've created so far on this planet. All right, let me get going here. So I'm going to talk about basically four different concepts, two of which I'll go over relatively quickly because we want to get to the part about what can we do, what is being done, what are the processes that could lead to a better Anthropocene than the one we're creating now. And the first is really about theory of change. Why did we get to this time? Why have we produced this planet where everything is changing because of us? So that's the beginning, more or less, a theory of change, and that we need that if we're going to move forward and talk about what can we do, what are the options, and even the most important question of all is, who is we? Is there even such a thing as we together acting on the planet? And so again, to start with a theory of change, very simply, I think you've all heard of the Anthropocene, and a simple question for the scientific point of view is, what kind of a science is the science of the Anthropocene? And for a lot of people, it's the natural sciences, because the term Anthropocene is a geologic related term. But the simple question is, can you understand the Anthropocene as a physical process? Can you understand it as a chemical process? Can you explain why the Earth now glows at night? This planet that never glowed before at night now is a planet that glows at night. And I find this night glow is a great example of an Anthropocene process, because it's something that, as we know, can only be explained as a social process and a historical process and a material process of the human world. If you want to understand why this planet glows at night, you need to understand it as a social change process. And when we talk about social change processes, the simple question is, and a lot of people argue about this, I think somewhat fruitfully, just because this is a change process that is global and transformative, does that mean we're in control of this process, we humans? And the answer, I think, is very simply no. This is just something that has emerged from our social activities over a very long period of time. No one intended the Earth to light up. It just happened as a byproduct of us lighting our outdoors. And so that is a simple fact of most of the Anthropocene. It's an unintended consequence, not an intended one. The other is, can we turn off the lights? Just turn them off. Well, in fact, no, nobody can just turn off these lights. There's a kind of a, I forget what it's called, but it's a day where everyone's supposed to turn off their lights. So there's a little bit of possibility there, but in fact, nobody's really able to turn off these lights. We're not really in control of an Anthropocene. It's very easy and appropriate to look at the Anthropocene as a crisis, a recent phenomena in which are, for example, burning of fossil fuels, which is changing the climate at unprecedented accelerating rates with extreme potential to harm both people and the planet. It is a crisis. And another one that you often hear about, of course, is tropical deforestation, another type of crisis, very rapid changes that are changing the planet, changing the biosphere. We talk about the sixth mass extinction. For whatever you think of it, it's true that our extinction rates on this planet right now are also very rapid and very much in a crisis mode. There's a lot of change that's very rapid going on that we don't want to see. But there's also a deeper way of understanding human transformation of the planet. And we need to think also of the archaeology of the human transformation of the planet. And I like this illustration. This is not a building foundation. This is a geoglyph or a cultural product, right? This was designed to make for some kind of symbolic cultural purpose. And it was pre-Columbian. It was before the the Europeans came with their diseases and wiped out huge populations in Amazonia and reforested landscapes that were in use previously. And we can now see this deeper history of the Anthropocene change, human changes in the environment now, thanks to modern changes. So we have to look a little deeper. Extinction is not a new thing for human societies. Even Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies had technologies capable of wiping out species that were unprecedented in many ways. And so we need to think deeper about the changes that humans have made to the planet. And we can go back as far, of course, as the megafauna extinctions of the late Pleistocene, but really the big one that we'll talk about is agriculture and urbanization and how that cleared the land, tilled the land, and produced even some early forms of climate change. So the used planet of the Anthropocene is not a planet that just recently started to change. It's a planet that has been changing for thousands of years as a result of human activities. The biggest global change that humans have ever made to the planet is not global climate change caused by fossil fuels until about maybe 1950 or so. Around that time, you start to see climate change caused by burning of fossil fuels to become the most globally significant pattern of global change. However, agriculture is really, for most of history, it is the big change. And that's about 40% of Earth's land transformed into crops and pasture lands. So we have this anthropogenic biosphere. And this is just one representation using the anthropogenic biomes. We have a human biosphere. So the big question really is not when the Anthropocene begins, but why? Why does only one species in the history of the planet, and people talk about the cyanobacteria species that transform the planet through photosynthesis, but that was actually many species, not one, and it occurred over hundreds of millions of years. Here we're talking about a single species in, at the most, tens of thousands of years, changing the functioning of this entire planet. And I call that the first law of the Anthropocene, is that human societies create unprecedented reshaping of the functioning of ecology at increasing scales. And when we want to understand why the planet is changing, we need to think about this similarly to the way we think about climate change, but with human societies as a force of nature. And essentially, just like we think about weather and climate as two parts of the same climate forcing, these Earth system change forcings of climate change, we need to think in terms of the human weather and the human climate. And I'm going to talk about the human climate first. This is the long-term, global scale, relatively slow changes that humans have introduced, human societies have introduced. And I'll do that using this theory of anthroecology. Again, this theory of change. There is an anthroecology.org there. If you go there right now, you'll see a site in progress. I'm getting ready to transfer my website to anthroecology.org. Right now, it's not finished. So if you want to find these papers and all that you can read, go to just search, Google search anthroecology, you'll find it. And we're going to just talk about this theory about why humans change the planet so much, sociocultural niche construction. The classic view of ecology that is really already outdated. It's not the mainstream view for most ecologists anymore, but a very simple view of how species and biota in general adapt and evolve is they evolve through being shaped by the need to adapt to an abiotic environment that they cannot change. They are simply shaped by the environment and by other species as well. Okay, and that would include climate. So that's a one-way street of evolution, a relatively simple pattern. However, ecologists are increasingly aware and use the concept of ecological engineering or ecosystem engineering. And there's a lot of species that alter their environment. In fact, the greatest, I think, one of the most important evolutionary theory changes, is this concept of niche construction, which is based on the idea that when organisms transform their environment so much that it affects their evolutionary fitness, then that's called an ecological inheritance. Okay, and that can accumulate over time. So we need that concept to understand why human societies have become so transformative. That makes evolution more complicated. It's a two-way street. Organisms aren't just shaped by the environment, they can also shape their environment. That's not just humans. That's a lot of species. Some people say all species shape their environment enough that it also affects their fitness to reproduce and thrive on the planet. And therefore, that two-way street evolution is the general theory. Either way, we need this theory of ecological inheritance to understand why humans transform the planet so much. The next one is cultural inheritances. We need to understand that as well. Humans are the ultimate example of social learning, but it is not unusual at all in the biological world. There's plenty of species that learn things from others in order to survive and reproduce. And this is an example of a songbird that must learn its songs from other individuals in its environment. If it can't learn these songs, it cannot reproduce. So it is a cultural inheritance that increases the fitness of this population to reproduce. We also need to understand sociality in general. Social learning and cultural inheritance is just one part of sociality, and it's not necessarily that common among social species today. Everyone's familiar with social species, right? Your ants, your termites, all these different species that have all sorts of features adapted to essentially create a social group, a genetically highly related social group that shares the environment, that also engages, here's a niche construction as well, right? They're making nests, etc. But these general patterns of sociality are genetic. So that's what I want to shift from. Humans are, of course, the ultimate social learners, and we learn socially and are able to teach and share our cultural inheritances with each other so effectively through language and other practices that we're able to accumulate large amounts of culture. We have huge amounts of culture. That is really exceptional. There's really very few examples of accumulating culture among other species. So you put these things all together and you get one part of the theory here, ultrasociality. Humans are ultrasocial, the first ultrasocial species. When exactly that begins is debatable, but we have a socially learned social organization. The way that we are social together and behave together is not based on our genetics, right? It's based on our social learning, our culture. So hunter-gatherer cultures, the cultures of traders in the financial district of London, these different ways of being social together are entirely learned. You could shift a hunter-gatherer from Amazonia into London and they could trade stocks probably within a year or two. I don't know if the reverse is as easy to accomplish, but the reality is our sociality is socially learned. It evolves through culture, and culture evolves much more quickly than biology does. We put all those ideas together, ecological inheritance and cultural inheritance, and the idea that we are social. It's very important that everything we do it together. We do it as a group. As a force of nature, we are a social force of nature. We are also a cultural force of nature. Our sociality and our niche construction, the way we alter the environment, it is socially learned and it evolves over time as a result of cultural evolution, not just biological evolution. That has accelerated the ability of this species, our social species, to engage in different types of sociality and different types of niche construction or earth transformation than any other species in history. And this continues to evolve today. We're always evolving new ways of sharing with each other and making it possible for us to essentially act as a society, not act as individuals. Okay, and that's a transformative process when it scales up. So to understand the ecology of human societies, we need to think of this as a socio-cultural system. It's not humans. Humans as individuals are just another mammal, a sophisticated one with some interesting traits, but the interesting thing about humans is our societies, and those societies are cultural. They're determined by the evolving cultures. They're, of course, very diverse. And so when we have a theory of change of humans and their changes of ecology, we need to think about how this sociocultural system, or anthroecosystem is a term I now use, how that evolves over time. And of course, like any system that evolves, and I would say culture is evolving and our societies are evolving as a result, some of this is just gradual, just passing the inheritances on with some selection. But there's also these really transformative, what we call regime shifts in sociocultural niche construction and the way our societies operate in relation to the environment. And some of these are so big that they basically changed the game completely. And let me just talk about some of the biggest ones of all. The game-changing transformations, regime shifts I would call these kind of the meta regime shifts. They're not really individual ones that we could point to, but the grand scheme of things is looking at types of big changes in the way that human societies have shaped their niche. And we see a few trends here. And the most interesting ones, and I don't know whether you can see my pointer operating here. Can you see my pointer on the screen? Excellent. So you can see our social scale has increased over time, not in a simple linear fashion like this illustrates, but generally the larger scale societies come after and evolve from smaller scale societies. And of course now, how big can a human society be? It is unknown. We cannot say how big a human society can be because it could evolve to become bigger. The other thing that's very interesting, and I'll just go to the one down here, is that we've learned to substitute energy from the biotic world with abiotic energy over time. Now, we've used energy to subsidize our ecology from a very early time. The first use of fire to cook food is a way of actually taking energy from outside the human body and use it to essentially supplement our energy system, our metabolism, by cooking the food instead of having our digestive systems have to do it. And then we learned to do all sorts of things with burning the biosphere, different types of fuels, mostly from biomass. We discovered fossil fuel. Of course, that became a huge transformative effect that we're still reeling from. And of course, bigger energy substitution, more energy per person. These are per capita types of estimates here. We're talking just in general. And then the interesting thing, we now have solar and wind and nuclear, and these are energy sources that do not come from the biosphere. All right, only plants can do that before us, right? We're a species that can now use abiotic energy to supplement our own social ecology. And then finally, this other one that is, in a sense, I would say one of the hopes for the future is niche construction intensity, all right? When we start off in these small scale societies, we need a lot of land per person in order to sustain hunter-gathering activity over the long term. But we then learn to make this more productive. And I'll talk about some of the practices through burning the landscape, through collecting more species. These are cultural changes. And eventually we learn agriculture. And of course, what this does is it transforms the environment more, but you need less environment per person, less land per person as you transform the environment more. We've made the biosphere, we've reshaped it to become more productive for people. Just like any evolutionary process, do not believe in simple linear pathways like that chart I just showed you, right? Evolution is complex. The hunter-gatherer societies are still around and they're still very functional where they are. All right, so you can't say that there's been this general, say, improvement in things. Things have gotten more complex. Societies have gotten more large scale. They use more energy, etc. But it doesn't mean that one is better than the other or anything like this. And of course, many societies have gone extinct. And that is a part of every evolving process, including today. All right, let's talk very briefly about this intensification process and social scaling before we get to some questions. A lot of people think that the scaling of land use intensification begins with agriculture, all right, this ability to get more from the same area. But actually, this is something that begins long before agriculture with different practices. These are socially learned practices. The first one and simplest one is just simply what's called dietary broadening. First, you're the woolly mammoth culture, and you eat woolly mammoths, and that's most of what you do. But then the woolly mammoths go extinct or become harder to hunt, and you need to use more species. And these hunter-gatherer societies are very capable of using many, many species. That is an evolved capacity to get more food from the same environment. We burn the landscape to make it more productive for game and for hunting. That's another common practice of hunter-gatherers that changes the game for the productivity of the environment. We process the foods, and that sounds kind of boring and kind of silly. Why would you make a big deal about that? But actually, that's what puts us on the road to domesticating all of the species that sustain us today for the most part. If you don't have the skill to actually take lots of these tiny little wild seeds and grind them up and produce things like bread or tortillas or something like that, you cannot use these wild grains. And so that puts us on the path toward agriculture. Of course, with agriculture, you have a long history of intensification, right? The first farmers were mostly shifting agricultural farmers. They would farm an area and then move on. and keep doing that over time. And so they don't want to use a small amount of land at one time, but a huge area is required to practice long fallow farming. But as you get more dense in population, increase the demand and less land is available, which is something that happens over time, obviously, right? When populations grow, you end up with annual cropping, having to farm the land every year, much harder. This is not a story about like people just kicking back and relaxing. This is a story of working harder to sustain societies. Finally, you end up with some of these traditional practices of farming and multi-cropping that are extremely labor intensive, that actually make it very difficult to survive, but people did. They learned to do this and produce more food. At the same time, societies are scaling up. They're urbanizing. They're developing hierarchies and different classes that have enabled societies to scale up. Why do we do that? Why would you do that? Very simply, there is a return on investment for living in a dense settlement. Now, of course, as we're learning from COVID, there are some negative aspects of dense settlements, and those were obviously seen in the past, and there's maybe seen today, who knows? But settlement scale actually improves the livelihoods of people in the settlements for the most part. And so urbanization, of course, is nothing new, and it's well known that different things, most of them good, but some of them bad. Crime also scales up per person in an urban area. But the bottom line is urbanization has a return. And therefore, what we see even today, the biggest global change in human societies is the ongoing urbanization of the planet. This is huge. This is a reshaping of the way that humans are social together. It's a huge example. And when we think about it, it often is thought of as the biggest changes are going on in the cities. But this is not true at all. The biggest changes on this planet are going on outside the cities. The huge areas of the world that are shifting from relatively small scale production systems to these large scale systems, very intensive, very subsidized, globalized networks of food distribution that are capable of sustaining these dense populations in cities. All right, so it's changed the world all over the place, this large scale system. And I think the lesson here is one of the kind of, maybe this is a joke, but it's hard to say that this is completely wrong. As God has spoken on Twitter, there is no problem you can't solve by creating a bigger problem. Okay, the bottom line is here we are in the Anthropocene, where ecological change and even Earth system change is now a matter of social and cultural change. If you want to understand what the planet's going to be like in 50 years, it's a matter of understanding human, social, and cultural change, not a matter of physics. All right, time for some questions.
Thank you, Will. Great, that's a terrific start. There's a few already in the chat box, so I'll invite those people to speak. We'll kick off with Adil's one. Adil, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking about like your long time horizon perspective on how people have, for lack of a better word, terraformed their surroundings. And in the context of that, do you think that the implications of the Anthropocene, like climate change, are sort of like a novel, inherently bad thing, or are they just a morally neutral, unprecedented anthro-ecological phenomenon?
Great question. And as a human being, I'm very concerned about the future of the planet because of this, uncontrolled climate change. I think it's the only way to say it, right? Human societies are not in control of this phenomenon. We are creating it, we're not in control of it, and it's not going to good places as far as anyone can tell. Okay, so that in that level, I'm very concerned as a human being. As a scientist, I do see it as a phenomena. It's just something that's happening. It's very clear what's causing it. It's not hard to understand that. But there you go. So I see it in both those different ways. As both, it is a crisis for human societies today. Can we bring this under control or not? But as a scientist studying the kind of the Anthropocene and human-induced planetary change, it's just one more of many phenomena of global social change.
Okay, great, thanks. Waller and Bazin, do you want to, I'm not sure. Full name.
Yeah, sure. Actually, my question kind of
I do switch on your camera when you pose a question, it's quite nice.
Oh, sorry. Is my
Maybe
camera not on?
Oh, I see you.
Okay.
Okay. My question refers to one of the main concepts you started with in the lecture. So might not be that relevant after everything you showed us. But just coming back on the question of crisis, you know, some thinkers are saying that it may be depoliticizing the question and might not be that accurate for the current situation, insofar as the crisis implies, you know, a beginning, a climax, and an end. But every day, you know, it seems that planetary boundaries are being shattered, and that climax basically has been reached, and we're already in a situation of crisis. And the crisis implies that we'll be going back to status quo after. There'll be a post-crisis situation. So should we be talking about more of a mutation, a radical transformation? That's probably what you imply in the term crisis as well.
Yeah, good point. I think implied there is a criticism of the crisis narrative of the Anthropocene, perhaps. And there is a kind of a two-headedness about talking about the Anthropocene in the Anthropocene Working Group as well, where some folks say, we've got to stop these global changes. And then other people saying, these global changes are irreversible. It's a little bit of a two-headed thing. For me, I'll be honest with you, studying this, again, it actually relates to the previous question. On the one hand, I can look at this as a human being, and I do see it as a crisis. For societies, this is a crisis. We are faced with something, we need to act, we need to do something. And if we can accomplish some action, we could have a different future. So I see that as the purpose of having a crisis narrative, is we must act. I hate to see this, you know, if we don't act in 10 years, it's all over, because that's not true, right? Everything we do can improve or make things worse, and that'll be true 10 years from now too. And so I also see this as a scientist as a condition. And it relates to that tweet of God slide I showed before. That's been our condition for a long time. We are often solving one problem by creating a bigger problem. One of my greatest concerns is we don't do that with the climate system and start geoengineering our way out of this problem. It would be very much in tune with past behavior of human societies. So it shouldn't shock anyone that might happen. But I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's bad to get in the process of trying to control everything, because you end up in this kind of spiraling game of scaling toward generally not getting what you want, just creating another problem down the line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I do see this as a condition more than a crisis from a scientific point of view, right? We're always going to have some problem like this. When we solve the fossil fuel problem, we will still have environmental problems, and probably some of those problems will come from solving the climate problem.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Robert, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, you'll have to excuse the lack of camera because I'm having some technical difficulties, as you might hear. I just wondered if there has been any exploration into whether there might be a theoretical tipping point within urbanization where it could lower the quality of life to increase population density within a contained urban area. So we were talking about scaling, so I just would be really keen to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a great question. I have to say, I don't think there's any simplicity about this. The tipping point narratives generally, in my view, tipping points exist. There are processes that have tipping points, but I found that in general, you can only view them from the future. You can't view them from the time in which the process is occurring. And so it's not a very useful framing for understanding change. Is there a tipping point in cities where density becomes something that is undesirable? I don't think there's one tipping point, because it depends on how you live in your city. I mean, for a particular urban form, this might be true, that you get too dense for that form and then it doesn't work. But I don't think that it's impossible to create forms that work at higher densities. And I think that's actually one of the great challenges of human life in the Anthropocene, is creating these ways to densify. That's my view.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I see we have Sandra Diaz joining us from Argentina. So Sandra, do you want to pose your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Erle. I enjoyed that. My question is how you see the debate between land sharing and sparing within your framework. Do you think that intensification, which has been producing more and more food over history, will get us to the place we want, or are you skeptical
That's an excellent question. I can say this. So I'm part of this community that does talk a lot about these kinds of subjects. And for many of us, this is a false dichotomy. From my view, it is more or less of a false dichotomy that you can intensify within the same landscape that you're sharing. And there can be sustainable or smart intensification. Clearly, any land that is producing a crop is likely going to be less valuable habitat to a lot of other species. So there's always a trade-off. We can't get rid of trade-offs between using land for one thing and habitats and all this. There's always trade-offs. But the challenge of the Anthropocene, and I'm going to talk specifically about this subject near the end, is how to balance these two things in the same landscape. There is no nature left outside somewhere untouched by people that could be conserved. So we need to focus in on how are we going to share intensive landscapes with nature. We're not going to be able to de-intensify agriculture fully if we're going to support the people that are alive now and will be alive in 2050, right? We're talking at least 9-10 billion people. There's no way to sustain those people by reducing production on the same land unless we want to expand land use radically. So I see the challenges to do both. We must intensify and share the landscape better.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take just one more before we move on. Maybe Michelle Sanders, would you like to pose your question?
Yeah, I was just curious, when you're talking about going from less to more complex societies, whether you see that as more of an active sociocultural process or continual accidental incidences. I'm thinking about the marginal zone theory here and the fact that some people theorize that hunter-gatherers mainly stayed in equilibrium until there was environmental disruption that pushed them to the margins, which then caused them to start doing agriculture and all those things. So yeah.
Another great question that I don't feel like I can fully answer with a simple answer there. I would say that these kind of scaling processes are mostly, I would say they are mostly unintended. They just occur because there are some kinds of advantages to them. And when people are living increasingly in a human world, structuring that human world to favor some groups over others is almost inevitable. And clearly, when you have high levels of inequality, it can become a destructive fact. A lot of societies collapsed because of extreme inequality. As for the emergence of agriculture as a result of marginalization, I'm not sure. I would say the jury's out in my mind on that one in particular. I think there's a lot of reasons for intensification.
Okay, great. I suggest we move on to the next section.
Okay, so here we are on this planet where we are transforming ecology everywhere. So what do we do? What is our situation? So just a quick review there. About 40% of Earth's land is now directly used for agriculture, meaning if you stop using it for agriculture, you stop production somewhere. Okay, so that's about 40%. About a quarter or less could be considered as an area that is not currently in production. Most of those, and is outside of the landscapes where people are producing things. They're not productive areas for the most part. That's not completely true. There's areas of the world that could be very productive if they were used, but that's a small part of the area where there's no people or land use. The other interesting fact, though, is that there's this other part. There's the part embedded within the used landscape that is not intensively used. And that's the part for me, and this gets onto the land sparing, land sharing element. This is a huge part of the Earth. It's relatively productive in biodiverse areas that is currently embedded within the human landscape and needs to be considered essentially the best hope in many ways for conserving biodiversity on this planet is managing the novel ecosystems embedded within the human used landscape, sharing them more effectively with the rest of life on Earth. These kinds of ecosystems, these novel ecosystems, the lands left embedded when landscapes are used, are present just about everywhere on Earth. They're not just in one part of the world or another. They're basically present everywhere where there's no use or the use is 100%. There are places in the world where almost all the land is directly in use for agriculture or settlements. In those areas, you don't have so much either. But even there, you tend to. So what are these areas like? Well, they vary a great deal. Here's an example from China. And if you look closely, and if you don't, you just see kind of scrub, but you can actually see that different households are managing different parts of this forest in different ways, right? Some of these are planted trees. Some of this is being harvested for fuel. Some of it is being left to regenerate and nobody cares. Okay, that's the forests of the planet today. They are novel and they are used forests. When we think about the ecology of a woodland, it's tempting to just go to a biological definition. Let's just talk about, say, an oak hickory association. But in fact, when these forests and woodlands, and I don't use forests for all these, are embedded within the human world, to understand their ecology, just like trying to understand climate change, you need to understand the social processes that shape and have shaped those woodlands for maybe thousands of years. It does depend, but there are all these different forms. So when we think about basic things like ecological succession, a theory of change in ecology, the fundamental theory of change in ecology, some could argue, we need to think about this as a human social change process. It's a social change interaction over a very long period of time in which we see transformations. They're not necessarily always going in one direction, just like succession without people, but there's a tendency towards certain forms of societies and certain forms of ecology interacting together, larger scale societies producing more dense settlements, for example. So here we have this human social world. We are the most capable, most globally interconnected societies that have ever existed on this planet. Our ability to interact with each other is unprecedented and amazing. There is no social species that can communicate with every other individual in the group instantaneously like we now can with cell phones and the internet. We have superpowers as a social species. What are we going to do with those powers? And can we actually do something together instead of just letting things take their course, which has been most of history? Well, there's some good news in a certain way, in that some things that have been happening are actually better than they could have been. And if you were around in the late 1960s, early 70s, and you read The Population Bomb, and you believed Paul Ehrlich, you thought that this entire planet was headed toward disaster with mass starvations. That did not happen. Why did that not happen? Two reasons. Paul Ehrlich was wrong about one of the most critical parts of his narrative. He thought that population growth rates, the bottom line there, the blue one, is population growth rates, would continue to either stay the same or go up. But he was wrong. They have crashed. We are now in a population growth rate collapse. Even though populations continue to rise, because we have a lot of momentum with these large populations, the rate of growth is crashing, and we expect populations to level off. That's one reason why we are not using more agricultural land than we were in the 1970s. Basically, that's more or less leveled off, even while food supply per person has increased. What has produced that capacity to feed more people, or at least produce more food over time without using more land? That's intensification, okay? And it's green revolution technologies. It's caused a whole slew of problems with pollution, etc., but it has managed to feed billions of people. And it's going to be essential in some form to feed the future billions that we can now expect in the coming decades. Some people see this as just a terrible thing, the green revolution, but some other folks have looked at it more as an opportunity. Large scale farming, operating with big investments in intensification, machinery, etc., are not interested in farming in marginal land areas. They just abandon these. These areas get abandoned all over the world. I've seen it all over China. Small scale farming abandoned by people because it just doesn't pay off, and only the best land is getting used for agriculture. That means other lands, and I've seen this again in China, big recoveries of land all over the place. Of course, around where you are in Oxford, right? I'm sure you also see large recoveries in forests that were probably, used, especially in the United States. We see this all the time. So there's opportunities that come with scaling and concentrating the production. So the question for me, and I think the question for societies around the world, is not really what our situation, our crisis is, but really what kind of planet do we want to shape in the future? We have the capacities to shape a very different future than the one that we have been shaping so far in theory, right? But in practice, will we be able to do that? And as you see, the we is in quotes here. Who is we? Is there even any such thing as we? Are we talking about we scientists? We're not in charge. Scientists are not in charge by any stretch of the imagination. We have visions for a better future, but does that even matter? Are we going to influence things? The nations of the world, of course, are a part of the we. Consumers have a huge effect. Their decisions have huge effects. Farmers, the people who manage the land. Who is we? Who are the different people in this situation? We're all facing different conditions, different ideas, and we don't have this virgin planet to do whatever we want with, right? We have a used planet. Okay, we're working with what we've got, what's been passed on to us. It's like any kind of used clothes or whatever. We're not operating with this planet that we can just do whatever. Okay, we have limits that way. We have a planet that's going to heat up. It's going to heat up no matter what we do, almost. There's maybe a few options that won't allow it to heat up. So we have to deal with a planet that has to shift. Biomes are going to be moving toward the poles as the planet heats up, and species need to move. If they can't move, they will go extinct unless we can do something about that. We have not built our infrastructure in a way that is designed to facilitate the movements of any species but us. Okay, we've reshaped the biosphere with our infrastructure, cut it up into pieces, and made it very hard for movements. This is the kind of situation we're in when we think about, what kind of future are we going to create together on this planet? But let's not forget, we are also capable of producing landscapes like this. This landscape, of course, is a human cultural product. There's some bad news here. Let's not forget, there were hunter-gatherer societies living here. They were expelled to make Yosemite as a park. Okay, so that was a bad news thing there. But on the other hand, one other thing that did happen, there is another valley that looks almost identical to this nearby that was also, people hoped could be conserved, but it is now a reservoir for California, for San Francisco. It's called Hetchy Hetchy. This is a land use decision. It's a way of thinking about what kind of future do we want. We can do different futures. It's not all about intensification by any stretch. And already we've worked pretty hard to protect a lot of land. Not hard enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But the idea that we do nothing but destroy the environment is not a correct description of the way human societies shape nature. We've set some aside. We've made some targets. These are global targets. This is the we acting as nations, maybe not the US, of course, unfortunately. And there's some bigger ambitions, okay? We can think not just, how can we stop the crisis? We can think, what would the better planet look like? It's the reason I like this concept of half Earth. I like the idea that we're not just talking about what's the latest disaster we can end, but rather, what would a good planet look like? What would the better planet of the future look like? And I feel that this is a good vision in which you are thinking about making space for the rest of life on Earth. But this is not a simple game here, and the scientists don't get to decide. Here's an example of something I think is maybe a bit misguided. I like the idea of bringing science in and trying to get more knowledge for decision making, but here is a global model that describes where the conservation shall be. This is the optimal way to conserve half the planet. And I have to ask, so if someone brought this map to your neighborhood, would you say, okay, I'll move my house, I'll move out? This is the idea that you could somehow top down operate the Earth. I don't think that's an option for human societies. So we also have this human world. Okay, it's not just about the wild world, it's about the human world. It's about the novel ecosystems. It's about the landscapes that we manage. It's not just about finding this green space in between. It's all about working together. And there are consequences, huge consequences potentially, if you manage the landscape one way versus another. And this is just one example from a paper. Actually, Zia Mirabi was the main person who put this analysis together in another paper. But if you manage the landscape to share parts of it with nature, rather than just going for large scale nature conservation and large scale production, when you share, you actually have the potential to create more space for nature while you're still sustaining food production for the rest of the world. And of course, that's the real challenge. It's not about conserving, it's about sharing with nature and people. And indigenous people are hugely important here. They're fundamental, they're at the core to thinking about any change in the way that land is used at this kind of scale. Indigenous people already live in some of the most valuable nature areas on the planet. How can we expand that indigenous sovereignty and culture of nature to larger areas. That's a fundamental way to think about it. Ultimately, though, as I said, the key here is not thinking about what can the science tell you, even though science is, of course, very important. I'm a scientist. I work on this too. It's ultimately about what people want. And that's going to be the big challenge that we talk about in the next section. What do people want? How did that change? And we need to think about, if we're going to share the biosphere in the future, we need to do that within the conditions that we actually have. And only a small area really is in this, can be set aside in any kind of classic sense. And when we think about Earth stewardship, yeah, it's cool to think about all the kind of global top-down thinking and science we can do. And I do a lot of that, so I'm mea culpa. But we can't really think about Earth's stewardship this way. It's really what goes on the ground that matters most. What do people want on the ground? How will they work together to accomplish these kinds of strategies? We do have some new technologies that can help. It is now possible to look down on your space for free from an app. And that's amazing. You can actually monitor things, and Indigenous people have started to do some of this with help. And that's a good example of a new thing. We can enter into different types of consumption behavior when we understand where things come from. Doesn't always work. It's complicated, but it is a process that we can help engage with to make connections between the sources of what we're doing and our consumption of what we're doing. All right, time for another set of questions. And I do have another section that would probably take about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, let's move on to some questions. Maybe Marissa, do you want to kick off with your question?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned this throughout your lecture, but if we need to better manage anthropogenic landscapes and the idea of novel ecosystems in the future, what do you think should be priority considerations there?
As I'll talk about in the next section, because that's a great question. That is the big question, in my view. It's all about engaging people with their aspirations. My view is that the most powerful force of nature in the Anthropocene is the social force of people's aspirations. What do people want to have? What do they want to do together? And when people are motivated to do these things, they can reshape the planet. They can reshape their neighborhood. So how can we better work together and motivate activities that create the better future rather than a future of degradation and increasingly, I'd say, selfish use, where people aren't thinking about the bigger picture of what we do together. So yeah, it's very much a social issue.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for possibly some other questions, I'll pitch one in. So what do you think about the balance between what could be called total protection, protected areas where you have fully intact ecosystems, and whatever we do in these shared mosaic landscapes? You know, they both have advantages and disadvantages. A shared landscape isn't always perfect for biodiversity considerations. So what do you think, how do we compromise, or what's the balance?
I unfortunately have kind of the ultimate punt answer, which is, it depends. And it depends, I would say, partly, of course, on what's there. There are places where certain species live, at least today, right? And as we talked about, right, species may not be able to live in the future where they live today because of climate change, which might mean that it's mostly about how we can move species around to conserve them in their habitats they can live in. But the bottom line is there are some habitats with great diversity and endemic species that don't live anywhere else. And those places, I mean, obviously, if you turn that into a farm, you're likely going to threaten those species. On the other hand, most of the land that is currently not in production is these smaller pieces that are within these used landscapes. And that kind of shared landscape is, in my view, where we really need to put a lot more attention. And it's more challenging because obviously there's not going to ever be no trade-off between production and conservation. And it has to be balanced. And it's going to depend a lot on social demands, social relations. Do people trust each other in these conditions? The fortress conservation model, where you can conserve nature in any place by just pushing people out, is over. Those days are over. And so it's never going to be about the ecology. It's always about the sociology. How are people going to work together in these places that in a fair way that is sustainable?
Okay, Maria, would you like to pose your question?
Yes. Hi, do you hear me? Thank
Yes,
you.
okay.
My question is just, I think this is also connected to the previous question, because I'm not sure, and I was thinking particularly on the Amazon, to what extent sharing landscapes can provide enough to maintain ecosystem services. And I was particularly thinking on the ecosystem connectivity in the Amazon, how important it is for maintaining the water cycle.
I think that I'm not sure exactly what that question was about, like the importance of sharing landscapes in Amazonia or
Yeah, so my question is rather if this
connectivity.
could work like a strategy worldwide, or if there are some ecosystems where this cannot work, such as the Amazon, because of ecosystem connectivity.
Well, excellent point. And obviously areas that have never been used for intensive agriculture, I would put a high priority on never using them for intensive agriculture, because these places are very rare and the species left there are relatively unique. So that's important. I don't believe really that we really need to open up a whole lot more new areas to production. In areas that are already in production, connectivity is just as important, and scaling that up in the working landscape. And it is possible to do. It takes planning and coordination to make connectivity happen in landscapes that are owned by many people, used by many different people with different needs, different economies. But that's what really has to happen. And again, it's a kind of social change that would make connectivity happen in a shared landscape. But I think there's large areas of Amazonia where it doesn't make any sense at all to enter into any more production in these places. So I'm not trying to advocate for like land sharing means let's open up all the landscapes of the world to production. That's not what I think it means to me, at least.
Okay, there's a request to.
I'm going to talk specifically about this in the next section.
Great. There's a request to visit Nikki's question from the first section that I didn't get to. So Nikki, would you like to pose your question? It slightly goes back to the early part of the lecture.
Oh yeah, this jumps back right to the start, but you talked about our ultrasociality as a differentiator from other species. And I wondered what you thought about the role of imagination in shaping and scaling human societies. So our ability to construct or to create constructs, I guess, like the justice system and money.
And you said imagination though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to get right into this in the next thing, but the fascinating thing about the way that human societies shape nature and work with nature is that it requires them to have a perspective on what you can do. And that depends partly on technology, but it's partly imagination. There's new ways of interacting with nature that we haven't practiced yet that might be much better, especially as the way we interact has to change. We can't be hunter-gatherers and be 7 billion people. Not possible. So how can we be 8 billion people on this planet in a way that conserves nature? How do we do that? That's a whole new challenge. And it requires imagination. And it requires a big change in the way we think about things. And I'm going to talk right about that right now. So let me just jump right in. So as I said, I was saying before, I see the greatest challenge of all. Protected areas far from people or kind of isolated from people, that's an important practice, of course. But I think the bigger and harder one that will have the biggest impact if we can do it well is managing these anthropogenic mosaics of landscapes that we are using part of and have part of not used or not used as intensively. And so what do we do? Now, the reality is there's always trade-offs and sometimes just direct conflict between human world and natural world, human use and the use of other species. And this is the classic example where someone can actually get killed by a deer. It's a herbivore killing you because you're driving your car into it, right? It's bad for everyone. This is the ultimate example where things don't work. But we're smart creatures in a lot of ways. We figured out solutions. It's not as simple as that you build roads, it has to all be 100% bad. You can build better infrastructure. It's not perfect. Maybe not having any road at all is better. That's often true. But we can also build roads with infrastructure standards that say not just that you have to have drainage along the side, but you have to have wildlife mobility included in the design with things like tunnels and bridges. Okay, and so you can't build a highway You can't maintain a highway without these standards. That's just a big change in the way we do things. And of course, this is occurring with many things. This is an example of riparian zones put in to agricultural landscapes through a government program. It's another kind of design, just changing the interaction between the used land and the land that is less used. We need to do this not just a little bit at a time. We also need to do it a little bit at a time, but we also need to do it at large scale. We need to think really big about how we're going to work together. And there's a lot of prospects for this. It's actually happening already. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative and this Spine of the Continent larger scale, connecting these together. People are working together to solve some of these problems at scale. The good news, and also this, in the Anthropocene, of course, the ecology that we value, that societies value, is not something that is biologically determined. It is determined by culture. And societies change when culture changes. And culture is changing. Culture is changing all over the world. When I lived in Beijing in 1990, okay, this is not my photograph. I lived in Beijing in 1990s, cold winter, very gray in Beijing. And then spring finally comes and I'm sitting down in the park and I hear the birds singing and I'm thinking, you know, Beijing's not so bad in the winter and et cetera. And then I turn around and every single bird that you can see in the park is in a cage, okay? In 1990, that was about the biggest aspiration you could have for nature in Beijing, all right? That was about it. That was kind of what people could do. Now things have changed quite a bit. This man is not abusing pandas. This is the largest funder of panda conservation in the world. And I guess he's getting kind of a little perk here, being able to snuggle up to all these pandas. But the change has come to China. Chinese people are, in general, changing the way that they value nature, and that conservation is now this thing that people really care about a lot. And the value, the way that people see nature has changed in China. It's changed as their society has changed. People don't want to see a panda riding a motorcycle anymore, okay? In 1990, you could actually find a place to go see that, all right? Nowadays, that is not happening anywhere. People want to see a wild panda. They want to see a panda that can live on its own. That is exciting. That is an aspiration of Chinese people now. People are willing to do the very strange things, difficult things, to bring the panda back to the wild. And this is not a crazy person. This is obviously somebody who is raising a panda in a form, in a way that it will not become domesticated or attuned to people. This person's wearing a panda suit covered in panda urine for the purposes of not making this panda essentially unafraid of people. Okay, so this is what's going on right now. The wolf is coming back to Europe. Now, it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean there's no conflict. There are conflicts. It's not easy to live with wolves. All right, there's a reason why they were mostly extirpated from Europe, but they're coming back. Why are they coming back? It's because there's a lot of people who want them back and they're willing to do what it takes. They spend the money, they pressure their governments. The cultures are changing. The aspirations are changing. Östsportsplatsen is an example of just a whole new way of thinking about doing conservation. It's not always successful. It's very difficult. Östsportsplatsen is not a place that is far away from people. Östsportsplatsen is right next to a big suburban neighborhood, okay? And those people do not like all these dead horses in the middle of the winter. And they complain and make trouble, and they have to adapt. And these two groups that want to do the conservation and want to have their nice suburban neighborhood life, they have to adjust and negotiate. And that is the future of nature. We are inventing, we are creative. There are whole new ways of living in the city. This is an example of the Bosco Vertical in Milan, which actually has inspired a lot of construction. There's big whole cities that are being constructed like this in China. This is a vertical forest, and this is a vertical forester who is maintaining the forest of this building. It's completely encrusted with trees. I'm not saying this is the way to go. I'm not saying this is green environment, but I am saying this is an idea of this imagination. It's the design thinking. We could do something that you've never thought of before. We can do something new. So it's not an end game here where we can only have diminishing returns. There are whole new ways of living on this planet, and we need to embrace those, because right now we have the most social species in the history of this planet is now changing everything. I'm not talking about termites, right? We're talking about people. And we started doing this a long time ago. Since we've been on this social road, of change, we have created some of the most amazing and unusual and exceptional types of natures that have ever existed on this planet, maybe that ever will. And we need to work with that if we're going to have a better future. When we think about the Earth system, it is no longer sufficient to think that physicists can run the model, or that Earth science can be done without a very deep understanding of how the human sphere of things works. The anthroposphere is just as important as the atmosphere or the biosphere in understanding how the whole Earth system functions. So we need to think about that. We need to get beyond this kind of archaic thinking that the Earth was kind of in balance and nothing ever changed on Earth, and then humans come along and disturb it. It's not as simple as that. We have a culture of nature, and many cultures of natures, in fact, are together what shape the planet that we've lived on for thousands and thousands of years. We have a nature now that's entangled within our cultures, entangled with our human systems. It's not enough to just do the science. We have to find ways to motivate social change. Social change is not going to come from information. Social change is not going to come from science. Social change is going to come from people wanting to do things differently. And that's going to also require some changes in culture and society. And we should never forget, and it's funny, I've been showing this slide for years, but it's never been more true than today. When we think about what it means to be human, we're not 100% human. We're about 90% human. The rest of us is a whole bunch of microbes, okay? That's what it means to be human. We are connected to the biosphere. We are not separate. We never have been, of course. And what it really takes is a new way of thinking about this human social ecological relationship if we're going to create the better future that we want. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's my last slide, and I'm glad to take any more questions. And I'm just going to pop in a little shameless plug here for my book. If you're interested in my book on the Anthropocene, it's a very short introduction. You probably have heard of that because they come from Oxford University Press.
Great, thanks for the plug. I think actually your book is one of our course recommended pre-course readings as well. So, great, thank you, Earle. Okay, well, there's a few questions. So let's kick off with Sol.
Thank you. I have a question about what you said of constructing a better world for the future, and considering the complexity of human societies and also the difference there are among there, I was wondering how we can achieve that idea if everyone has different priorities. Thank you.
Yeah, that is the question. For me, that is the question. Right? How do people with different, and that's true within a society and across societies, right? Like the priorities, the values, the needs of different groups, that's within society too, are different and often in conflict, right? To have more wealth for people that are at the working class level and the people at the upper class level want to take that wealth, there's a conflict. There's a lot of conflicts. And the reality is that, well, sometimes these things don't work out well. And the conflicts lead to, in a sense, collapses of societies. And that's not a new thing. In fact, the idea that environments and environmental change have been the cause of societal collapses in the archaeological record is largely refuted by most studies of archaeology of societal collapses. They're mostly caused by the failures of those societies to be able to adjudicate and operate with these conflicts. Simple example, okay, you have a drought, a big drought. Some societies navigate through this, get to the other side. Some societies collapse. Is it the drought that caused this collapse? Generally, no. It's the same kind of society can weather this drought. How do they do it? Generally by building irrigation systems. That takes a lot of social capital to do that. Building an irrigation system, making granary systems to store up the harvest and share it socially when there's times of need. Okay, societies that can do these things can continue to operate through challenging environmental changes. Societies that do not have that form of social capital, where groups just divide up and just essentially the elites that could make decisions or could change the relationships between distribution, don't do that. They simply just ride on. Those societies don't usually make it. And it's a social element that matters the most.
Okay, Jody, would you like to ask your question?
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah, my question was around whether you ever think society be willing to accept managed population decreases if it meant a sustainable and equitable future for all. I'm just thinking in the context of when I lived in Hong Kong, there were days you couldn't go outside because the air was too bad to breathe, and we were quite happy to give up that liberty. But why do you think the kind of ultimate liberty of, reproduction whenever you want, do you think that's something that people or society would ever be willing to give up?
Well, it obviously depends on the society, but I was already saying that I lived in China in 1990, and the one-child policy was firmly in place in 1990. It wasn't always enforceable or enforced, but it was something. I can tell you there were two interesting things about people's reaction when I talked about it with them. And one was, we hate it. We hate this thing. We don't like, we want to have more kids, especially the kids who, there's this big thing about having a boy. You need a boy to carry on your name. You need a boy to take care of you in your old age, because the tradition is that women go to the other family. So you get no care if you have a girl child. And so people were not happy with this, but I never heard anybody say it wasn't a good idea or wasn't necessary. All of them, and this was people that were talking off the record, I can tell you, over a beer or something. They would say, there's so many people in China. It's so crowded. There's so little land. It's an old saying in Chinese, "Ren duo di xiao." There's just too many people, too little land. And so people were willing to tolerate it. The interesting thing, though, is looking back on this, not myself, but economists and people who have studied the effects of the one-child policy on reproduction, is it did have effects, but a large part of the effect of the population leveling off in China was just economic. People who live in cities, when the girls have education, there's so many aspects of development that shape people's decisions about whether to have a large family or not. And the reality is that most of the effects of development and education, essentially just making it a priority to support girls, it makes a huge difference right there. You don't need to have a policy that's about restricting reproduction. You just need policies that support people's family planning and give them, especially young women and girls, the chance to become educated and empowered. And generally family planning follows from that. And families planning generally leads to smaller families. It's just a simple fact. You don't need to have a restrictive law. And of course, the restrictive law has been mostly lifted in China, and it is not having this effect of like now everyone's out reproducing like crazy. Not at all. They're actually really concerned that their population is going to crash, and they're going to have too few young people in the population to take care of everyone else, because that is often what happens when you have a lot of economic development. Look at all the countries that have a lot of economic development. You can see reproductive rates in those places are below the total fertility rate that will maintain population even at an even level, usually. So we're mostly going to be looking at a population decline. There's some areas that are different, but most of the world is experiencing a big, rapid population decline.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'd like to pitch in a question. This is actually largely going back to the lecture we had on Monday, but it'd be great to have your opinion on this. Is sort of the big question that we had in our lecture on Monday. Should the Anthropocene be formalized? And if so, where would you start, and then what process would you use to find it start?
Yeah, great question. Well, I'm not going to say that the people in the Anthropocene Working Group who started the process of formalizing the Anthropocene within the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which maintains the formal definitions of all epoch names. Okay, when you're talking about making a new epoch formal in the sciences, they're the group that does it. There's no other group, the people who maintain the geologic timescale. So to become part of the geologic timescale, there's only this way. You have to go through a working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And so they're trying to do that, and they feel like it's an important activity. I think it's important for everybody to be aware that scientists consider the Anthropocene to be real, that we are living in it now. I've never met a scientist, and I hardly met anybody who doesn't already believe that. People believe we live in this human age where people are changing everything. That doesn't require the International Commission on Stratigraphy to declare an Anthropocene epoch. And the Anthropocene epoch that can be defined, there's no alternative right now. The only one that is allowed to be defined right now is 1950s. That the entire world changed more or less instantaneously at some date in the 1950s. This date might even be a single day. It depends. But that is the way that these things are defined as epochs. And I do not feel like that is a useful definition. It will not be very useful to scientists. It will not be useful, I think, to hardly anyone. So if there's going to be a formal definition, I would like to see a definition that would be more generalized. That would just, very similar to the definition that's in the dictionary. The dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, includes the Anthropocene now. And it's just the age in which human societies or humans become a force transforming the planet, something like that. That's a good definition. It's all we need, I think. I don't think we need an epoch that's formally defined by the ICS.
But does that generalized definition still require some sort of start date, just for convenience? If you don't know, if you're talking 500 years ago, is that in the Anthropocene or the Holocene? Do you need to still come up with a start date?
It depends on who you are. I see it as there can be many beginnings, stages, phases. And that's actually the way that some of the scientists who are now trying to formalize it as 1950 had published on it as having stages. But you cannot do that in the ICS procedure. So there's only the opportunity for a 1950 epoch, no other opportunity. And so I see many beginnings and I see spread. I don't see something happening instantaneously in 1950. I see things happening in different parts of the world at different times, leading to a general process of global change. I don't see it as something that can be confined to a particular date when the whole world changed.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, let's, I think you have time for a few more questions still. Yeah, we still have about 10 minutes, so feel free to fire some more questions and students as well. Christine, do you want to pose your question?
Sorry, it took me a second to find the mute button. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I wanted to ask if you think it's important to incorporate or how you would see the idea of incorporating legal frameworks to protect or build on social cultural changes, but specifically rights for non-human beings, ecosystems in that regard. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good one. Again, I'm going to punt a little bit and say it does depend. Some societies operate in highly legalized ways, where legal systems are actually, the transactional framework for almost everything. And I would call we call that tame societies, tame conditions versus wicked conditions, in which you have very different, unequal people that are seeing things very differently and don't agree on common things. And they can be disempowered by an elite doing a legal action to another group that has no power to influence those rules. And it's essentially a form of cover for some elites' desires rather than a space where different equally empowered parties can negotiate. So I see it depends largely on that. Do I think that, and a lot of indigenous cultures see the river as just as much a part of the decision process and just as empowered in the way they think about things and act on things as another person in their group. And in that case, you really don't need a kind of a legal framework. You've got a culture that already does this by practice. If the legal practice occurs, okay, maybe the tribe that actually would have that traditional relationship with the river is no longer an actor in that process because another group, the protectors of the river, now owns the legal rights to decide about the river. So you have to be a little careful with legal systems. It depends on the kind of the playing field. And if the playing field is like what we call a tame field, like Europe or UK, right, where citizens can muster action to empower things. There's almost nobody who doesn't have any legal rights, right? People have rights. People have some ability to be empowered. It's still not completely even, but it's more even. So the tame situations, these kind of things make the most difference, I think. In settings where you have the wicked challenges, I think it's a little bit hard to think just one legal framework will solve the problem. There's probably other elements to the problem that won't be solved that way, even be made worse.
Yeah,
Good
thank
question.
you.
Good question.
Okay, thanks. And Rodrigo, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Dr. Ellis, thank you so much for your lecture. I was thinking about when you mentioned about the green revolution. Do you think there are any technological prospects or innovations that may help overcoming the current environmental challenges that we, as like in the past?
Absolutely. And even though I don't really believe that technology makes the changes, I don't believe that. I believe it's societies have demands for technologies that make the changes. If the social demand is there to solve a problem, someone will find a way, and those ways could be used. Solar energy existed since the 1940s, maybe even the 1930s. It was possible to do it. There was no demand, right? Fossil fuels are cheap, and there was nothing wrong with fossil fuels. As far as anyone knew at that time, they weren't really thinking about it so much. It wasn't a big deal. Then it became a big deal. Now solar all of a sudden is like this big deal, and everyone's trying to use solar, and that's great. And so it really has to do with demand. Are there ways to make conventional green revolution technology farming less hazardous to the environment? Absolutely, tons of ways. And there's so many ways that are actually, some of them are being used. Some of them are more profitable. For example, precision agriculture can use less fertilizer to produce the same yield. And that is profitable in many cases. So farmers are already doing some of these things. There's simple things like pearled urea that's got coatings. You can make the fertilizer delivery much more efficient, right, than just dumping fertilizer everywhere. That's like first stage use of the technology. People aren't really using it in a very scientific way. Interestingly too, larger scale farmers have the potential to use these technologies more effectively. It's an unfortunate thing, and it can hurt the small farmers. And I don't have an issue with small farming. I like small farming, okay? But, and it does make it harder for them because they have a harder time buying the fancy equipment, using the advanced technologies in many cases. It's not as economically actionable for them. But the realities are there are lots of technologies. If we want to subsidize small farms, we want to have them, we may have to subsidize them. But there are ways of doing these things, yes. Can we eliminate all harm from intensive agriculture? No. Can you eliminate all harm from agriculture? No. Can we stop doing agriculture? No. That's our situation. It's a combination of harm reduction and planning, better action. But I think the potential is there to make things much better than they are today. And I think anyone who just kind of gives up and says it's just a disaster is wrong, scientifically wrong.
Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I was wondering, you were talking earlier about the wicked framework where societies are unequal and certain parts of society is not empowered. Do you not think that that exists on a global level, in that certain countries are not empowered to really come to the table in these kinds of discussions? And where, for example, much earlier you were talking about that certain areas are obvious to, that makes more sense to protect as the untouched wild, and then certain areas more for integration, for example. But a lot of those areas that are untouched are from the least developed, poorest countries that I would say are the least empowered. So then they have to benefit from the intensification of agriculture elsewhere as much, and to be incentivized to protect. So really what I'm asking is, how do you see the development of global social capital? I mean, the progress in developing global social capital and cooperation.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, that's also big picture, big problem, and absolutely true, right? The wicked framework applies almost best to the global settings, right? Where you have really powerful countries and really weak countries, and areas that the weaker ones are the ones who need development the most. And a lot of that development could come from agriculture, as it did in every country. Every country has relied heavily on agricultural development as the core of their economic development, later industrializing, but first agriculture. So that's, how do you do that fairly? It's not, I don't have a simple answer to that, other than that, if you don't do it fairly, you can expect it not to work, because people won't go along with it. People just won't go along with it. They will cheat. They will do whatever it takes, because that's what, you can't keep people down, basically. And so, you want to make a big conservation area out of Amazonia without adequate compensation, so that everyone who's lost the opportunity to do development there doesn't feel like they're getting their value, They just won't follow the rules because those rules, aren't fair. So I think it's pretty critical. That's finding those kind of fair strategies is the key to success, whether, either way. Don't imagine that it'll just be solved with money. Although money can make a difference, you can compensate people for the loss of something if it's done fairly. But it's hard, like you said, it's a wicked setting. It's possible for actors to overpower others, but it doesn't usually work out in the end. It doesn't usually work out over the long term. It's not effective. If you really want to conserve those forests, you can't just kind of get in there and pay less than they're worth to those people. It won't work.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Elias, do you want to ask your question? Are you there? Can't hear anything, so I'll ask it for you then. I'll read it out. So you emphasize the entanglement of humans and nature, and this has existed throughout human history. So what do you tell someone who says that this emphasis neglects the unprecedented nature of human change today, the crisis of the now gets perhaps diluted by this long-term entanglement story?
I would say that human societies have long faced unprecedented challenges. They've created these challenges largely, right? When you start hunting out species, when you're able to hunt the last individual of a species, you create a crisis big time, right? Your entire strategy for livelihood is gone forever. So what do? Well, humans are pretty good as societies, at least, of finding adaptive strategies. They don't always do this, but it can be done. But yeah, will we be able to navigate these unprecedented challenges today, which are really much more global than they ever have been, much more rapid in some ways? They're very rapid changes that are affecting everyone. It's debatable whether we can navigate these or not. I don't think that we have a precedent to show. Is it possible for us to navigate these? I do believe yes is the answer to that. It is absolutely possible. It'll be possible to the extent that our societies are capable of operating at that scale together. If we're able to do things fairly and effectively across societies, I think we can. There are potentials for a better future. Otherwise, the possibilities of things falling apart are real and should be a concern. But the answers are not going to come from anywhere other than what are we going to do together? It's all about scaling the actions to the scale of the problem.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I think that's probably quite a good point to wrap up. So I'll just say a final thank you to Erle. What's really impressive about your work is the scale at which you think, both temporally and spatially, globally, but also covering all of human history and the depth of understanding of agriculture in particular and societies and how it's transformed throughout human history. But the other thing that's always really comes across is your optimism. Despite all the challenges we face, there's this effusive optimism that societies can find solutions and work their way through it. So, which I think is perhaps not what always comes across in all of the writings and talking about the Anthropocene. So thank you for your perspective. If you want to unmute your microphone, everyone, and give them a round of applause. It's always nice to hear real applause. So I'll start off.
Thank you for your great questions and for listening. I appreciate it, especially in this time when it's hard to be social.
Yeah.
All right, I have to go now. I'm teaching my next class now, so I'll see you all later. And it was great having a chance to share with you for a little time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.